Daniel Tammett was 25 years old when he was diagnosed with synesthesia on a background of high-functioning autism. He wrote that, "For as long as I can remember, I have experienced numbers in the visual, synesthetic way that I do. Numbers are my first language." He said, "Numbers are my friends and they are always around me. Each one is unique and has its own personality. 11 is friendly and 5 is loud, whereas 4 is both shy and quiet." Tammett went further to explain that he sees the number 1 as a brilliant and bright white, and the number 5 as a clap of thunder or the sound of waves crashing against rocks. He added that some numbers such as 333 are beautiful, while others like 289 are ugly. Understandable, I suppose. Tammett could also handle and calculate huge numbers without any conscious effort. He said, "I also have various sensations or emotions for certain numbers," and he illustrated this with how multiplying with 11 gives him a feeling of the digits tumbling downwards in his head. Tammett's synesthesia is intimately linked with his autism, and they seem to act together to give him his superior mathematical skills. For example, Tammett said, "I recited 22,514 digits of pi without error in a time of 5 hours and 9 minutes to set a new British and European record and raising funds for an epilepsy charity in 2004. Tammett narrated his story in his memoir titled Born on a Blue Day. Hello, I'm Ibrahim Imam and welcome to this episode of the Neurology Lounge podcast, in which we will be looking into the intriguing phenomenon of synesthesia. According to Richard Cytowic and David Eagleman in their book titled Wednesday is Indigo Blue, synesthesia is simply joined up sensations, and synesthetes simply have a different texture of reality. They liken the synesthetic brain to the weather system on the coast, where all the elements interact because there are no barriers to keep them from mixing. They described what happens in synesthesia, demonstrating how the perception of letters and numbers, what are referred to as graphemes, do not just elicit these images in the brain like they do with you and I, but they go ahead to evoke color. And how the perception of sounds, what are called phonemes, not only trigger the sensation of sound in the brain, but also provoke the sensation of taste. In a similar way, they described how sounds may also trigger color, leading to colored hearing. Explaining that there are up to 152 different forms of synesthesia, Cytowic and Eagleman nevertheless wrote that color is overwhelmingly the most common synesthetic response. Although the most common manifestation of synesthesia, they reported, is when days of the week evoke specific colors, they also explained that another form of synesthesia is emerging as perhaps more common. And they call this special sequence or number form synesthesia. This is a form of synesthesia whereby concepts such as numbers and time units, especially days of the week and months of the year, occupy specific places in space, and the person with synesthesia can actually point to them. On the rarer end of synesthetic experience is when sensations evoke taste. And this is symbolized by the example of Michael, who Cytowic described in his book titled The Man Who Tasted Shapes. Michael, his friend, had told him that, "I know it sounds crazy, but I have this thing, see, where I taste by shape." The occasion was a dinner he was preparing for Cytowic when he unconsciously blurted out that there aren't enough points on the chicken. and he was referring to the amount of sauce on the chicken that he was roasting at the time. Michael went further to describe how flavors for him had shapes, and he wanted the chicken to taste pointed rather than spherical. He also explained that he feels the shapes of his taste all over his body, but that he particularly feels them rubbing against his face or sitting in his hands. Explaining that he had experienced this all his life, he illustrated it with how tasting an intense flavor sends a feeling down his arms to his fingertips, feeling its weight, texture, and temperature. Cytowic immediately recognized that Michael had no walls between his senses, such that taste, touch, movement, and color merged together seamlessly in his brain. Another strikingly similar depiction of taste-related synesthesia was chronicled by Dr. Guy Leschziner in his book titled The Man Who Tasted Words. There, Leschziner described the case of a 60-year-old man called James, whose lifelong synesthesia involved what Leschziner referred to as a fusion of his hearing and his taste, whereby sounds are accompanied by tastes and by textures. For example, reciting the Lord's Prayer in school had brought on extremely strong bacon textural taste. His synesthesia would also interfere at exam times when he would be distracted from reading the questions by the sounds of the big echoey hall, or even of a pencil rolling across a desk and then falling off and clattering on the wood floor. It is typical of the ignorance of this condition that even his general practitioner dismissed his symptoms as products of his wild imagination, which he told him he would grow out of. The other dimension of James's synesthesia is with words, such as when Tottenham produced the taste and texture of sausage. He further explained that names may taste nice or unpleasant, and he talked of how he is attracted to women based on the tastes their names evoke. It is interesting that even the words of his inner speech have the same effects as his spoken words. Similarly rare is when letters and numerals assume personalities or genders. In their exploration of the diagnostic features of synesthesia, Cytowic and Eagleman pointed out that it is automatic and involuntary, and it is consistent over time in any one individual. They also explained that synesthesia is usually evident from an early age, and that once a synesthetic link is established, it seems to remain stable for life. However, they explained that synesthesia can wax and wane in strength, such as under the effect of fatigue, high emotion, and alcohol, which enhance it, and caffeine, cigarettes, and antidepressants, which reduce it. Although synesthesia strongly runs in families, they also explain that it can be brought on by such triggers as LSD and mescaline. Other acquired causes of synesthesia, according to Cytowic in another book titled Synesthesia, are sensory deprivation, meditative focus, temporal lobe epilepsy, and closed head injury. Cytowic also wrote that native Japanese speakers have the highest prevalence of synesthesia because, he said, they must map the same sets of sounds onto 4 different scripts. Tammett referred to his synesthesia as unusual and complex because he manifested many different forms of it. This form of complex synesthesia is perhaps best symbolized by the case of Solomon Shereshevky, the famous mnemonist who Cytowic and Eagleman said was a 5-fold synesthete. And they explained that having one type of synesthesia gives you a 50% chance of having a second or a third type. Shereshevsky's remarkable story was narrated by the Russian neurologist Alexander Luria in the memoir titled The Mind of a Mnemonist. There, Luria described Shereshevsky as a man whose remarkable memory was one of the keenest the literature on the subject has ever described, and he attributed this remarkable memory to Shereshevsky's marked degree of synesthesia. He was a newspaper reporter and about 30 years old when he consulted the author on the advice of his editor, because the editor said he never took down notes but could nevertheless recall his assignments word for word. After extensive testing, the author concluded that the capacity of his memory had no distinct limits, and his recollection persisted in some cases after retesting 15 years later. He reiterated that it was impossible to establish a point of limit to the capacity or the duration of his memory. Referring to his synesthesia as complex as well, the author said every sound he heard immediately produced an experience of light and color and a sense of taste and touch. He argued that for Shereshevsky, there was no distinct line separating vision from hearing or hearing from a sense of taste or touch. He added that synesthesia made his memory far more complex and distinctive than the usual type of eidetic or photographic memory. He went on to state that these synesthetic components were important for his recall, as they provided him with additional information to aid his memory. He illustrated this with how Shereshevsky converted words he has read or heard into vivid visual images which are then entrenched into his memory. The process whereby he did this was by distributing the words along an imaginary street. Nevertheless, the author maintained that this process is merely a superimposition on an innate, exceptional memory that was an element of his individuality. As an extension of his synesthesia, Shereshevsky could control his body temperature and heart rate, amongst other things, an indication for the author that there was no boundary between his imagination and his reality. Cytowic explained why synesthesia is associated with proficient memory when he said that the extra perceptual hooks give nearly all synesthetic individuals a superior memory. Apart from enhanced memory, synesthesia has also been associated with enhanced artistic creativity and communication skills. But on the downside, it is also linked with a weaker sense of direction and poor coordination. I guess you can't have it all. One of the rarer but more fascinating forms of synesthesia is called mirror touch synesthesia. A gripping example of mirror touch synesthesia was narrated by Joel Salinas in his aptly titled memoir, Mirror Touch. In illustrating how his synesthesia manifested, Salinas, a physician, described how he endured what everyone else was experiencing as he walked down a corridor. For example, he portrayed how he felt the weight of a baby that a mother was holding. An even more graphic example he narrated was when he was observing a cardiopulmonary resuscitation. He said, "I was absorbed in the man in cardiac arrest, fully immersed in his bodily experience. The sensations in my body mirrored the sensation in his." He also said, "I felt my own vocal cords tightened as doctors slid a tube down his throat." Other agonizing examples Salinas documented were feeling the physical pain of his patient who had Tourette's syndrome, chewing his own flesh. Salinas conceived of his condition as a high level of empathy which enabled him to connect with his patients. But this also, perhaps expectedly, took a heavy toll on him, such as when he said, "Whenever a patient died, I felt as if I had died too." He also wrote of how his synesthesia made it difficult for him to distinguish between objective physical reality and his subjective reality. Other evocative manifestations of his mirror touch synesthesia were clothes being uncomfortable when he wore them, and how physical boundaries are eliminated between him and his romantic partner, such that he felt like he cohabited two bodies. He went on to say, "The more time I spent with Christina, the more she became a natural extension of my nervous system, of me." Incidentally, on account of headaches, Salinas had an MRI brain scan which showed a lesion growing in his right parietal region, and a subsequent biopsy revealed these to be a tumor called a benign angiofibroma. To explore synesthesia further, I will be speaking to Jamie Ward, author of The Frog Who Croaked Blue, Synesthesia and the Mixing of the Senses, in the next episode of the podcast. Thank you so much for listening or watching the podcast, in which we started exploring synesthesia. If you found the podcast enlightening, you may consider subscribing to the Neuro Checklist website, where there's a bit more information about it. And you may also explore the softer side of neurology in my book titled Surfing the Brain. And to make sure you don't miss the next episode of the podcast, why not subscribe to the Apple, Spotify, or YouTube channels? Until the next episode, when I will be in conversation with Jamie Ward, thank you very much for your time.